The Bell telephone system brings you another of its series of programs on science, man's effort to understand nature's laws.
Soundstage, with its gadgets and equipment, will serve as a sort of workshop in the telling of our science story. The human senses, how they work, and what they mean to man. And to help us along, we'll have the assistance of various members of the crew who work here. Thanks for the tour. Bill, quite a place, this soundstage.
Yeah. They're ready on the Aristotle set, Doctor.
Oh, thanks. Let's go.
Oh, Doc, I always thought this Aristotle was a real old guy with a long beard, you know, real ancient.
Well, Bill, although Aristotle lived about 2,500 years ago, he wasn't always an ancient. When he was a young man, like many other people of his time, he was interested in trying to learn about the human senses. But here he is, getting a shave and surrounded, as always, by some of his students.
Certainly, there is nothing more distressing to the human senses than a dull razor.
Master?
Continue, Eudemus. What are your thoughts concerning the human senses?
As meat and wine are nourishment to the body, the senses provide nutriment to the soul. All knowledge must come through the senses. All that we perceive and all of the awareness of our daily existence.
Then we may summarize thus. These senses bring us touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and all that we know of the world comes to us through these 5 senses.
So Aristotle was the first guy to figure it out, huh?
Well, not the first, maybe, but Aristotle wrote some very interesting things about the senses. Well worth reading today.
Yeah, but everything comes to us through our senses?
Yes, indeed, Bill. Now, you think about it. Without the information your senses bring you, you'd be like a man locked in a dark cave. Now, in one big respect, Aristotle was wrong. We have many more than 5 senses. And for another thing, we don't hear with just our ears alone. We don't smell just with our noses. We don't taste just with our tongues.
Hey, wait a minute, Doc. After 20 years behind this camera, you're not going to tell and see with my eyes, are you?
No, in a strict sense, you don't, Hal. Your eyes, like your other sense organs, simply receive impressions from the outside and send them on to the brain.
And that gets into my department, Doctor.
Good. It's always interesting to see what you animators come up with.
Well, trying to draw a character that represents a sense.
Pretty tough assignment, huh?
You bet. But we have to show how they work. So we finally came up with our old friend Mercury, messenger to the gods. But a kind of a wiry, electrical Mercury. Very quick, responsive. Number 1 supplies us with a big percentage of our information. Reacts to the air vibrations we call sound. One of the 2 chemical senses. Another chemist, taste, specialist, reacts only to salty, sweet, bitter, and sour. Responds to changes in surface or skin conditions. So there they are, the familiar 5.
But not like messengers, really. More like dispatchers, dispatching information through the network of the sensory nervous system. Let's see how touch does it.
Okay. Now let's take the tip of the finger. That's where the sensory endings of touch are most plentiful. When the skin touches something, our friend here dispatches a sort of signal to headquarters.
Well, in very simple terms, that's about what happens. But how that signal gets to headquarters in the brain, That's the first part of our big story. Within our bodies is a marvelous network of nerves, nerves that carry the signals and carry them to the brain.
Carry the signals? But how, Doc?
By electricity. See, the nerves of this network are made up of the long, thin fibers of living nerve cells that can make their own electricity. Luigi Galvani, experimenting with what was then known as animal electricity, accidentally touched the big muscle in the leg of a frog with two pieces of metal that were in contact with each other. The electrical stimulus caused the frog's leg to jump. That was almost 200 years ago. And the arguments that grew out of Galvani's experiment led to Volta's discovery of the principle of the electric battery.
Doc, don't tell me I got an electric battery somewhere inside of me.
No, not batteries, but nerve cells. Hundreds of millions of them, each capable of making electric charges. Bill, turn on this machine, will you? This is an actual recording of the electrical impulses going from a living eye to a living brain. H.K. Hartline of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, who made this recording, is studying patterns of impulses in the optic nerve fibers and how these patterns serve as information for the brain. These impulses race through our sensory system whenever sense receptors trigger electrical discharges into the nerve fibers. Each nerve cell passes the impulse along by discharging its electricity to fire the next cell in the chain. The impulses jump along at speeds up to 100 miles an hour or more. These living cells are self-charging. They recover and are ready to fire again in a tiny fraction of a second.
Doc, then this nerve network can carry all the different signals from all the different senses.
Yes, that's a funny thing. The senses are all different. The signals are all alike.
Yeah, but then how could the brain know which sense is sending the message?
Bill, you've just asked the big question. That brings us up to the brain. It's the areas in the brain, the specific areas where the signals end up, that tell us whether we are touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, or smelling. Ever since Johannes Müller, the German physiologist of the 19th century, recognized this, scientists have been trying to understand how the brain transforms information it receives into action, sensation, and thought. After all, it's not the easiest thing in the world to look in on the actions and workings of a living brain.
Maybe that's where the animator has an advantage. He can invent one.
That's an interesting idea.
Look, here's just a few of the hundreds of sketches that we waded through, trying to make our drawings agree with your facts.
Couldn't find a place for those 12 billion nerve cells, huh, Gene?
No. We soon realized that the best we could hope to do was map a part of it into a kind of a electronic headquarters. This is our latest try. And it shows up pretty well on this enlarged drawing. Most of the nerve impulses enter here.
From the spinal cord.
Uh-huh. And they pass through here to this relay center at the base of the brain.
Yes, that would be what is called the thalamus.
And the impulses go on upward to their destination.
Yes, their destination in the gray outer layer of the brain called the cortex.
We've drawn electronic tubes to indicate the areas where the messages come in. Oh, here's a better view. Now, you see, if the impulses came from the eye, they'd come down through here. In the same way we've set up tubes for the ear, nose, tongue, touch, and all the rest. And these electrical impulses come alive as pictures on what we call the master receiver.
And I suppose the smaller screen represents the memory section.
Right. Impressions are recorded and stored there for later reference. Now, here on the master dispatching board, we transform sensory information into conscious action. Walking, talking, and so on.
All right, let's see this electrical headquarters of yours in operation.
Well, Lou's in charge of the making it work department.
So Lou's the one who really has to make these drawings move, huh?
Well, I do the thinking and he does the work.
Thanks, Dad. Well, Doctor, we've animated a little sequence here about a character we call Joe Commuter. Here he is, undisturbed by any outside stimulus, like that 7:15 special he takes 5 mornings a week.
Who's the little man? He's new around here, isn't he?
Well, he represents the thinking part of Joe's brain. He checks things against memory and past experience and decides Joe's actions on the probabilities of the future.
Joe? Joseph!
Next on the agenda, breakfast.
Good morning, dear.
And so, the day begins. What a beautiful day. It's nice to live in the country. I think I'll walk to the station. Well, what do you know? Wild strawberries. They used to taste wonderful when I was a kid.
Hold it right there. Now let's back up and break that action down into slow motion and see what happened. The first thing Joe has to decide is whether these really are strawberries.
Now that's where the eye comes in. They look familiar. Let's check. Strawberry, huh? Of course.
Well, what about the other senses?
Not much action here. Strawberries aren't very noisy. Meanwhile, touch is checking up on everything coming in contact with the skin. And so headquarters is informed. The berry is picked.
Wait a minute. How about checking with the lab? Sense of smell.
Aha. And that worried look is natural. After all, how do you describe the smell of a strawberry? Stimulus dispatched, analyzed, okayed by headquarters. Go ahead, eat it, taste it. Another chemist gets into the act. Taste this time.
How is it?
Should be sweet. Sour? Sour.
Well, a lot happened in those few moments. And Lou, what was it that triggered all those little sensory characters into action?
Well, the light from the strawberry carried the stimulus to the eye. Bee buzzing stimulated the ear, and the chemical reaction on the nose and tongue stimulated the sensory endings of smell and taste.
Stimulus. That's the key word, stimulus. Is that film ready?
All set, Doctor.
Fine. Let's take a look at it. It's the key word because all forms of life respond to a stimulus. It's one of the things that all living creatures have in common. Turn it on, Bill. Just as human beings with their complicated sense organs and nervous systems respond to the stimulus of touch, so do the simplest one-celled animals which can be seen only with a microscope. This is an amoeba. These various single-celled animals have, of course, no specialized sensory cells or nervous systems, but they lead a busy life in their microscopic world. The first important groups of multi-celled animals have a simple nerve network connecting individual sensory cells and are particularly sensitive to touch. Jellyfish have notches around the perimeter of their bodies in which there are sense organs sensitive to light and to food. This inquisitive-looking animal uses his tentacles for touch, but also has an eye at the base of each of them. These more complex animals have the sensory cells grouped together into sensory organs, connected by a nervous system with a primitive brain. In the insect world, you may find many surprises. The hearing organs of the grasshopper are on the side of his abdomen, and he tastes food even before he eats it, with small appendages outside his mouth. Most insects have organs for both touch and smell on their antennae. In some insects, sight is more important. The dragonfly has unique compound eyes that practically cover his head. Fish can taste all over their bodies. Like other animals, their sense organs developed according to their particular needs. The chameleon can look in two directions at once because each eye works independently of the other. The alligator has an extra eyelid to protect his eyes when he opens them underwater. Some snakes, like the pit viper, have a special sense on their faces that detects the heat of warm-blooded prey at a distance. Among the birds of prey, the falcon especially has a keen eye. The cat, whose senses are all quite well developed, is highly sensitive to the stimulus of touch on the tips of his whiskers. In each instance, the pattern of each animal's sensory development is reflected in the development of its unique brain structure. Compared to those of many animals, man's senses are much less acute. He can't see like a falcon, smell everything a dog smells, but man lives by his wits as well as his senses. Man, and only man, possesses a brain that gives him the capacity of imagination and thought far beyond the limited mental activity needed for daily survival. And only man has developed a singular ability to speak, to reason, and to plan far into the future. George, I know that this is your office, but what exactly happens here?
My job is to control the strength of the electrical currents coming from the microphones and bring them into balance on this console. It's called mixing.
And then it's recorded on film?
Not anymore. Magnetic tape.
Now, in other words, these sounds are first converted into electrical impulses, and then they're balanced and amplified in this console, and then recorded.
That's correct.
That's a lot like the ear works. Vibrations, electricity, sound.
So it is. But George's ear is a much more complicated instrument than the equipment he operates. How does the inside of the human hearing apparatus look to an animator, Gene?
Well, I'll tell you, Doctor. Let's find out by following the sound of chopsticks right into George's ear.
The outer ear is shaped somewhat like a funnel ending at the eardrum. The surface of the eardrum is pushed back and forth by the vibrations of the sound waves. The movement of the eardrum sets the ossicles in action, three little bones commonly known as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. This film shows the human eardrum, which is only about 1/4 inch across. These are the ossicles at work within the human ear. The tiny stirrup works with a rocking motion, creating pressure on the fluid of the inner ear, the cochlea. Driving back and forth, this little lever mechanism increases the pressure about 10 times. And now we discover what really happens to chopsticks. Here's a simplified view of the cochlea. It's lined with the thin basilar membrane, which contains 24,000 hair-like cells. In this illustration, they somewhat resemble the keyboard of a piano. The sound waves, now transformed into fluid pressure waves, disturb the hair-like cells along the basilar keyboard according to the pitch of the notes. Each pitch vibrates a particular group of tiny hair cells, triggering electrical impulses that proceed along the auditory nerve and form a brain pattern which to us means music.
Now, those nerve impulses we heard a while ago, they're the same for, well, seeing or hearing?
Well, to answer your question, Bill, come in and help me, will you? Here again is Dr. Hartline's recording of optic nerve impulses. Dr. Lloyd Beidler, Florida State University, has made these recordings of impulses originating in the taste buds. Recordings have also been made for smell, for impulses from the olfactory nerve.
They're all the same.
Yes, the impulses for all the senses are the same. There's another interesting thing a little further on this roll here. As the stimulus from outside increases, the number of impulses goes up accordingly. These things were first demonstrated in the 1920s by E.D. Adrian of the University of Cambridge. It's the same with all of our senses. Taste, for instance. This time, the chemicals of food or drink excite the hair-like cells of the taste buds, which line the crevices of our tongues. The remarkable thing is that taste is not just one sense, it's actually four: sweet, salt, sour, and bitter.
Seems to me I taste more different ways than just four.
That's because when you're tasting things, you're also smelling things. The range of smell seems to be boundless. Seem to be about as many different smells as there are things to smell. And of course, taste plus smell equals flavor. Gene, come on, we have to go over the West tricks.
Sure. You know, a fella told me that if you hold your nose, you can't tell whether you've got a little piece of apple or onion on your tongue.
Yeah? How about that?
That's right. When we taste something, the chances are we also smell it.
Hey, Doc, this pop tastes cold. Am I smelling that?
Oh, yes, that's another thing. In our mouths, we have temperature senses, which react to ice cream, hot coffee, hot and cold things. Certainly, we find that the sense of smell is most useful to man. Perhaps primitive man, like the animals, made much greater use of it. For most animals, smell is still the most trustworthy sense. Turn on the machine, will you? The delicate fawn uses his sensitive nose as well as his ears to warn of approaching danger. Many stories are told about the moth's extraordinary sense of smell, with receptors located on its most remarkable antennae. Ants, too, have receptors for smell on their antennae. Now we know about the rabbit: big ears, always cocked, and a busy nose, always alert. And speaking of a busy nose, Bill, in the case of the dog, do you know what he was smelling?
A bone.
Molecules.
You mean to say we smell molecules?
Whatever we smell is in the form of tiny molecules that, being volatile, take off into the air. We smell them as odors, aromas. For example, they bring us the first sweet scent of new spring blossoms. Rich and long-remembered experiences come to us through the air as tiny molecules, and wafted free on the clear morning breeze, they can smell mighty good. We help the molecules get to the right place by sniffing. They wind up in a chemical laboratory, for that's what the upper chamber of the nose actually is. When the molecules reach this chamber, they chemically stimulate the millions of cell filaments on olfactory patch. And from here, as in the case of the other senses, messages race as electrical impulses to the brain, where we experience the sense of smell.